The night Corporal Yusuf Driggs came home from Kepler Station. He smelled like recycled oxygen and machine oil and something else entirely, something his son couldn't name, something faintly wrong like the air before a storm that never quite arrives. His boy, Eli, was 7. He stood in the doorway of his bedroom in dinosaur pajamas, holding a stuffed bear with one glass eye, and he looked at his father the way you look at a photograph of someone you used to know. Not afraid, just measuring the distance. "Hey, Bug," Yusuf said. Eli didn't run to him. That was the first thing Yusuf's wife, Mara, registered. Not his gaunt face, not the new scar along his jaw, not the way he moved like a man who'd learned to distrust gravity. It was the way Eli stood perfectly still in that doorway, and the way Yusuf registered it with a flicker behind his eyes, a micro-fracture of pain so fast and precise it could have been nothing. They ate dinner without saying much. Mara had made rice and lamb his favorites. Eli pushed peas around his plate and asked about school things, a field trip, a project about volcanoes, a friend named Sam who'd broken his finger falling off the monkey bars. Yusuf listened with the focused attention of a man practicing something he used to do naturally. He asked follow-up questions at the right intervals. He laughed at the right moments. After dinner, Mara cleared plates and Yusuf stood in the kitchen doorway watching her, and she said, without turning around, "He hasn't slept well. He's had nightmares since the news about the Renali attack on the outer stations. Kids at school talking. I'll talk to him." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." He paused. "I'll talk to him." He stood outside Eli's door for a moment with his hand on the frame, feeling the wood grain under his fingertips. Then he knocked twice, soft, the way he used to, the way they'd agreed on back before. 2 knocks meant "I'm here," not "let me in," not "I need something," just "I'm here," Eli said. "Come in." The room was the same. That was the thing that kept getting him. Every time he came back from a rotation, and this was the third, 18 months this time, everything in the house was the same except him. The glow-in-the-dark stars, still mapped across the ceiling, in the rough shape of Orion. The model of the Kepler-2 orbital platform Eli had built from a kit, 3 years ago, still hung by fishing line from the curtain rod. The stuffed bear, which had a name Yusuf could never quite remember, sat propped against the pillow. Eli was in bed already, covers pulled to his chin, looking at the ceiling. "Nightmares?" Yusuf asked, kind of. Then carefully, "Dad, what are Renali?" Yusuf pulled the desk chair over and sat beside the bed. The chair was too small for him and always had been, and Eli watched him fold himself into it, with the beginning of a smile that didn't quite finish. "They're difficult to describe," Yusuf said. "I know they're aliens. I mean, what are they like?" Yusuf looked at the ceiling, at the glow-in-the-dark stars. He'd put those up himself. Before the first deployment, standing on Eli's little step stool with his sticker backing peeling off on his fingers. Eli had been 4. He'd been very serious about the placement. "No, Dad, that one goes more to the left." "Tell you what," Yusuf said. "You want to hear a story?" Eli side-eyed him. "About the Renali? About a soldier, sort of. A real one? A made-up one who did real things." Eli considered this with the gravity of a judge reviewing evidence. Then he pulled the covers up a little higher and said, "Okay." Yusuf leaned back in the too small chair and crossed his arms and looked at the glow-in-the-dark stars and started talking. Her name in the story was Sergeant Callie Voss. She was 34 years old, compact and sun-dark, with a mechanical left knee from an engagement on the Proxima relay that she'd never talked about to anyone except the debrief psychologist, and once, 0200 in an IO transit bar, to a demolitions tech named Obanya who'd lost 2 fingers on the same day Callie lost the knee. They'd clinked glasses and gone back to their drinks without another word. That had felt like the most complete conversation she'd ever had. She was stationed on Kepler Station, in the story, when the Renali arrived. Nobody called it an invasion at first. The official terminology was non-collaborative incursion event, which was the kind of language that gave colonels something to put in reports, while enlisted personnel used words considerably less polite. The Renali didn't announce themselves. They didn't broadcast demands or position manifestos, or even, as far as anyone could determine, try to communicate in any recognizable way. They simply began occupying. They moved like weather. That was the first thing Callie noticed from the external sensor feed. The Renali scout ships came in low over Kepler's outer ring, and they moved the way a cold front moves across a plain. Steady, distributed, inevitable feeling, not attacking, not retreating, just arriving the way a tide arrives. The complete patience of something that doesn't need to hurry. What do they look like? Eli asked. Shh. Sorry. The Renali were tall. That was the polite summary. And like most polite summaries, it was technically accurate while telling you almost nothing. They stood between 2 and 3 meters, with a bilateral structure that had fooled the first generation of xenobiologists into calling them humanoid before the biochemical scans came back. They had 2 vertical primary limbs, yes. They had something that served the function of a head. But the resemblance ended there. Because everything about them was designed for a world with 50% higher atmospheric pressure, 30% lower gravity, and a star that put out different light. Their skin, membrane was more accurate. Humans kept defaulting to skin, was chromatophoric. It changed, not the way a cuttlefish changes, in dramatic flashes of color, but slowly, subtly, the way shadows change when clouds move. Callie had watched the sensor feed for 20 minutes before she understood that what she was seeing as texture was actually a continuous slow shift in the light they reflected. A form of communication she couldn't decode. A language written in light, read by something with sensory architecture she shared no common ancestor with, not even a distant one. They didn't appear to breathe, at least not in any rhythm she could identify. The Renali had occupied 3 of Kepler Station's outer docking modules in 6 hours. They hadn't blown anything up. They hadn't harmed anyone. They'd simply moved in, set up what the sensor team kept calling anchoring structures. Objects that defied immediate material classification, placed at geometrically precise intervals, and then stopped moving. That had been 4 days ago. In the story, Callie had a specific problem. The remaining human crew, 41 personnel, civilians and military mixed, after the initial evacuation shuttles had gone, were clustered in the station's central hub, Module 7. The Renali occupied everything between Module 7 and the one functioning deep space antenna, which sat in the outer ring of Module 3. They needed that antenna. Not for a general distress call. Those had gone out in the first 12 hours, automatically. They needed it because the evacuation shuttle fleet was coming back in 8 days with a full relief force, and without updated sensor coordinates transmitted from Module 3's antenna, the fleet would drop out of FTL at the wrong position. 600 meters off target in deep space meant nothing to a ship, but this particular sector of space had a debris field, remnants of a mining platform accident 17 years old, that the fleet's navigation systems needed current drift coordinates to avoid. Without that update, there was a real chance the relief fleet would drop into the debris field. You didn't survive dropping into a debris field at FTL exit velocity. So Callie Voss had 8 days to get from Module 7 to Module 3 through 40 meters of corridor occupied by aliens she couldn't communicate, couldn't predict, and whose intentions she couldn't read. Why couldn't she just use a radio or something? Eli asked. They were jamming it. The anchoring structures. What were those? Nobody knew yet. They were still figuring it out. Did she try to talk to them? Yusuf paused. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when he was choosing words. That's a good question. She tried. She waved at them through the viewport, at first, held up her hands. Did they wave back? No, they didn't do anything. Which meant she couldn't tell if they understood or if they just didn't care. He looked at the ceiling. That's the worst version of not knowing. When you can't tell if the other side is ignoring you or if they literally don't see you. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, keep going. Callie's team was 4 people. She hadn't chosen them. They were who was left. Mickelson, a station engineer, 48 years old, been fixing Kepler's recycling systems for 11 years and knew every conduit and crawl space in the station's non-occupied sections, with bone-deep familiarity of someone who'd spent a decade fixing things in the dark. He was not a soldier. He was afraid, in the specific way of a competent person confronting a situation outside his competence. Methodically afraid, cataloging it, which made him useful. Dr. Nadia Ose, xenobiologist, who was in some ways the most dangerous person on the team because she kept trying to find patterns in the Renali light language and had so far been keeping notes in a green notebook she carried everywhere, which the rest of the team found either reassuring or unsettling depending on the hour. And Private First Class Dijo Abubakar, 22, from Lagos and had been on his first off-world rotation when the incursion started, and who had the particular courage of someone who hasn't yet learned to accurately assess how bad things can get. Callie Kissy found this both useful and heartbreaking in roughly equal measure. For 4 people to cross 40 meters of alien-occupied corridor, 8 days to do it. Day 1, they tried the direct approach. Callie, suited up in light EVA gear, walked to the corridor junction, stood in the open. She held her hands away from her body. She'd had Nadia write something on a panel, a mathematical sequence, the most universally proposed signaling language, and she held it up. 2 Renali were at the far end of the corridor. She could see them clearly. Their membrane skin did its slow, submarine shifting. One of them turned what functioned as its head in her direction. Then both of them simply relocated, moving to a different position in the corridor, with that unhurried tide-like inevitability, placing themselves between her and Module 3 without apparent urgency or apparent aggression. Just repositioning, like chess pieces adjusting on a board that only they could see. She went back to the hub and sat down on a crate and thought about it for a long time. She wasn't angry, Eli asked. She was furious, but she didn't let herself be furious for very long because being furious was expensive and she didn't have the budget for it. Eli considered this like it was something he would need to remember. She let herself be angry for exactly as long as it took to eat a protein bar, Yusuf continued. Then she put it away and started thinking. That's hard. Yes, Yusuf looked at him. It is. It's one of the hardest things. Day 2, Mikkelsen had an idea. The anchoring structures the Renali had placed at geometrically precise intervals. He'd been watching them on the sensor feeds, not for what they were, but for what they did. They were clearly some kind of environmental modification system. The air pressure in the occupied modules had risen by 12%. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees. The light spectrum was shifting incrementally. They were making the station comfortable. For them. Which means, Mikkelsen said, bent over his tablet with his reading glasses halfway down his nose. They're biological. They need a specific environment. We knew that, Nadia said. We knew it abstractly. I'm saying it concretely, which is different. He pointed at the sensor readings. These structures have a measurable effect on the environment. Which means they're systems. Systems have inputs and outputs. If we understand the input-output relationships, you want to modify the environment back, Callie said. Not dramatically. Not enough to hurt them. Just enough to create a condition they'd want to address. And while they're addressing it, Mikkelsen looked at her over his glasses. You're smaller than they are. You're much smaller. Callie looked at the schematic. The anchoring structures were in a pattern. Adjust the 4th one in a chain. The environmental effect would cascade in a specific direction. The Renali would move toward the disturbance in the outer ring. Their pattern of behavior, in 4 days of observation, is to attend to environmental anomalies in pairs. Both of them. For perhaps 40 seconds, the inner corridor junction would be unoccupied. Seconds, Dio said. 35 to the junction, 5 seconds of margin, Callie said. Running. I can go faster, Dio said. I know. Going. She looked at his expression. You're the one who knows how to operate Module 3's antenna. You're staying until I verify the path. He didn't argue. That was how she knew he was starting to learn. She made it in 38 seconds. The corridor smelled wrong. Not like anything she could name. Just fundamentally different. Some chemical signature. Her nervous system flagged as other and processed as threat. She pressed herself against the wall beside the junction and looked down toward Module 3 and counted. 2 Renali were moving away from her, toward the outer ring. Their movement was that slow, patient tide. They weren't running. They didn't appear to have a running mode. They just flowed toward the environmental anomaly with the certainty of water finding low ground. She had a clear line to Module 3's access hatch. She also had 6 other Renali visible on the sensor data Dejo was feeding to her helmet display. 2 of them were stationary. 4 were moving in patterns she still couldn't decode. She went back. You said she didn't go through? Eli said. Not yet. She needed to know more. She had a clear line. Why didn't she just run? Yusuf thought about this. Because a clear line you don't understand is different from a clear line you do. She'd learned something. She needed to learn more before she spent it. That seems slow. It seems slow, Yusuf agreed. But it's how you stay alive. Day 3, Dr. Nadia Osi had a different idea. And it had nothing to do with infiltration. She'd been building a model. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 48, and the green notebook was now supplemented by 3 tablets running simultaneous analysis programs. And she'd eaten approximately nothing, except the crackers Callie had put in front of her twice with specific instructions not to come back. Until the crackers were gone. The light language was not random. She was certain of that now. It had structure. Not grammar in any sense she could fully map, but rhythm and pattern, the same way you could tell a drum pattern had structure, even if you couldn't name the time signature. The Renali weren't communicating constantly. There were long silences in the patterns, intervals of what read as neutral on her spectrometer. But at specific intervals, 3 times in 48 hours, the chromatophoric patterns across every visible Renali had synchronized, all of them simultaneously, shifting to the same configuration for approximately 4 seconds. It's like a heartbeat, she said. Or a clock, something periodic. What does it mean? Callie asked. I don't know what it means. I know when it happens. In approximately 9-hour intervals from the last one, she looked up. Tomorrow morning, 0340. And during those 4 seconds, every Renali I can observe on the sensor feeds goes through the same synchronized pattern. I don't know if they're aware during it. I don't know if it's involuntary, but it's consistent. Callie looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Mickelson. Can you modify the environmental trigger timing so the disturbance hits at 0340? I'll need 6 hours. You have 8. Mickelson put his reading glasses on and sat back down at his tablet. Day 4, 0339. Callie Voss was crouched at the corridor junction in the dark. She'd turned off her suit's active systems to reduce any electronic signature. She didn't know if the Renali detected electronics, but she wasn't going to find out through a bad experience. The corridor was lit only by the dull blue glow of the Renali's anchoring structures and the slow submarine shift of light from their membranes. It was beautiful, actually. She'd thought about what Nadia said, a language written in light, and for a moment in the dark she'd thought, what if we're standing at the beginning of something enormous, and we're just too scared to see it that way? She'd put that away because she had a job to do. The corridor changed. She felt it before she saw it. Some shift in the air, in the frequency of something, like the world holding a breath. Then the Renali, all of them, visible and inferred from sensor feeds, shifted simultaneously to that same configuration Nadia had documented, every one of them, for 4 seconds. At 2 seconds, Mickelson triggered the environmental disturbance. At 3 seconds, Callie was running. The corridor was 40 meters. She'd run it at speed in her head 1,000 times, hitting the timing, accounting for the mechanical knee. She hit it in 31 seconds. For 6 of those seconds, she was running directly past a Renali that stood stationary in the middle of the corridor, 2 meters from her shoulder, its membrane cycling through whatever that synchronized pattern meant. She didn't look at it. She got to Module 3's access hatch. She got it open. She got inside. She sat on the floor of Module 3 for exactly 15 seconds, letting her heart rate come back, and then she got up and went to the antenna controls. The deep space antenna was intact. The Renali hadn't touched the communications equipment. They seemed uninterested in it, in the same way they'd been uninterested in most of the station's human technical infrastructure. As if it was furniture, as if it was landscape. She started the calibration sequence for the fleet transmission. That was when the door behind her opened. Uh-oh, Eli said. Uh-oh, Yusuf agreed. Is it a Renali? It's a Renali. What does she do? She doesn't run. Running is how you get killed in a small room with something twice your height. The Renali came through the door with that patient tide movement, and it filled the space with its physical presence, in a way that was less about size and more about difference. The wrongness her nervous system had been cataloging since the incursion started, up close, immediate, real in a way sensor feeds and visor displays had not prepared her for. It was 3 meters tall. Its membrane was doing something she hadn't seen on any of the feeds. It stopped, 4 meters from her. She put her hands out at her sides. The same gesture she'd tried at the corridor junction on day one. Hands out, fingers spread, weight balanced, expression open. She had no idea what open meant in Renali. She was working with the only template she had. It watched her with whatever it used to watch. She took one step to the side slowly, giving it a clear line to the door. Come in, or go, your choice. The chromatophoric membrane cycled through something slow and elaborate. She wished Nadia were here with the spectrometer and the green notebook. Then it did something she hadn't recorded on any feed. It placed one of its primary limbs against the wall beside the door and held the position for approximately 3 seconds. Then it retracted. She looked at the wall. Nothing was there. No mark, no device, no impression. Just the wall. What did that mean? Eli asked. She didn't know. She filed it away. Did she still send the signal? She still sent the signal. She turned back to the antenna controls. The Renali did not approach. It repositioned itself to the far side of the room, and its membrane cycled in that slow, submarine way. And Callie Voss put her hands on the console and ran the transmission sequence that would give the incoming relief fleet current debris field coordinates, and she thought, I am 31 meters from the nearest human being, in a room with an alien I cannot communicate with, and I am doing my job. And this is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to any person in the history of our species. And also, I really need to not die in the next 4 minutes. The transmission took 3 minutes 40 seconds. The Renali stayed on its side of the room the entire time. When the confirmation light went green, she stood up straight and exhaled, and then, she couldn't help it. It was involuntary. It was the accumulated tension of 4 days of controlled fear finally finding an exit. She laughed, not loud, just a brief, helpless, half-breath of laughter. The Renali's membrane shifted. She looked at it. She didn't know what the shift meant. She doubted she'd ever know what that particular shift meant. But she nodded. It was the only response she had. She nodded, the way you nod at someone across a room when you've both survived something. The Renali was still. Then slowly, it retracted back through the door. In the story, the relief fleet arrived on schedule. The debris field coordinates were correct. 600 personnel landed without incident. The Renali withdrew from Kepler Station over the following 48 hours, with the same unhurried tide movement they'd used to. Arrive, no exchange, no ceremony, no explanation. They simply began leaving, and then they were gone. And all that remained of their occupation were the anchoring structures. Nadia Osi spent the next 2 years studying and eventually understood well enough to publish the first working model of Renali environmental engineering, a paper that would become the foundation for the first actual Renali human dialogue 7 years later. In the story, nobody knew why the Renali left when they did. The leading theory was that the synchronized light pattern event at a 340 had somehow changed their assessment of the station and its occupants. The second theory was that they'd always planned to leave by that time, and the humans had spent 4 stressful days working around a schedule they could have just waited out. Nadia said, privately, that she thought both theories were partly right, and that the truth was something between them that neither side's language had a word for yet. Callie Voss thought Nadia was probably correct about most things. In the too small desk chair in his son's bedroom, Yusuf Driggs found the end of the story and let it sit for a moment. Eli was quiet. The glow-in-the-dark stars made their patient light above them, 43 constellations in a pattern that a 4-year-old had supervised with extraordinary seriousness. She never found out what they wanted. Eli asked. No, not then. Later, years later, there was a way to ask, and the answer was complicated. The way answers usually are when you're talking to someone who thinks in a completely different shape than you. What did they want? They were mapping hospitable environments, looking for places their species could eventually not move to, more like rest in, like migratory birds, sort of. They hadn't known the station was occupied when they arrived. When they realized it was, they had to decide what to do. And they left because of what she did, the signal. Yusuf thought about this carefully. Partly. Nadia's theory was that when Callie ran through the corridor while the synchronized event was happening, that was significant. It meant something to them. A willingness to be in proximity to something you don't understand, to move toward it instead of away. That's brave, Eli said. That's scared and doing it anyway, which is the same thing. Eli turned his head on the pillow to look at his father directly. It was the first time since dinner that he'd looked at him that directly, and Yusuf felt the weight of it. Dad, Eli said. Yeah. Were you scared? The glow-in-the-dark stars. The model of the Kepler-2 platform, turning slowly on its fishing line. The stuffed bear with the glass eye and the name Yusuf kept forgetting. Bear, he remembered suddenly. The bear's name was Bear. Eli had explained was the most accurate name, because that was what the bear was. Yes, Yusuf said. The whole time? Most of it. Did you do the thing she did? Put your hands out? Yusuf looked at his hands. He turned them over once, looking at the palms. At the new scar on his right palm that wasn't from surgery, but that he hadn't explained yet and wasn't going to explain tonight. We all do our version of it, he said. Everybody working those rotations. You're out there in something you can't fully understand. Things that don't think the way you think, and you can either be afraid of that or you can be. He paused. You can be interested in it. Those aren't the same thing, Eli said quietly. You were gone a long time. I was. Mom cried sometimes. I know. I'm sorry. She wasn't sad crying, Eli said, with the precision of a child who had thought about this. It was different. More like when you're watching something that's very big. Yusuf looked at him. I used to watch the news feeds with her, Eli continued, when they showed Kepler Station and the Renali ships. And she'd get that face. Not scared, more like, he searched for the word. Serious, serious. Like when you told me that thing can be both very dangerous and very important at the same time. When did I tell you that? Before you went, the first time. Eli settled deeper into his pillow. You said some things are both those things at once, and you have to hold both of them at the same time, or you'll only understand half of it. Yusuf sat with that for a moment. I'm home, he said. I know. I'm going to try to stay this time. Different posting. Ground-based. It's still important work, just. He stopped. I wanted you to know that. Before you went to sleep. Eli was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Yusuf thought he might be falling asleep, which would have been fine, which would have been enough. Then Eli said, was she lonely, Callie Voss? Yes. Even with the other people. Even with the other people. And she was still okay? She was still okay. She got better at it, actually. Not the loneliness. That's not something you get better at. You just get better at carrying it without dropping the other things. Eli's eyes were closing now, the slow, unstoppable way. Dad, he said, almost asleep. Yeah, the Renali who came into the room. When she was sending the signal. What about it? I think it knew Sue, what she was doing. Yusuf waited. I think that's why it stayed on the other side of the room. Eli's voice was soft with sleep. It knew she had something important to do. It was giving her room. Yusuf looked at his son, 7 years old, dinosaur pajamas, glass-eyed bear that was named accurately. The glow-in-the-dark stars that mapped Orion on a ceiling in an apartment in a city on a planet that had, 18 months ago, watched an alien species occupy a deep space station and come away with something that was not quite war and not quite peace, but was perhaps first shaky step towards something that didn't have a name yet. Yeah, Yusuf said softly. I think so too. He stood up from the too small chair. He tucked the covers up around Eli's chin. He looked at his son's sleeping face for a moment. The specific face, the one that was partly Mara and partly him and partly just entirely Eli, person who had been briefly a baby and briefly a toddler, and was now irreversibly and remarkably himself, 7 years old, with opinions about the Renali and theories about interspecies cognition, and the practical wisdom to name a bear after what it was. He turned off the desk lamp. At the door he paused. 2 knocks, soft on the doorframe. I'm here. Eli's breathing was the steady rhythm of sleep. Yusuf stood in the hallway. Mara was in the kitchen, and the light from there was warm and yellow, and he could hear her moving, the quiet sounds of a house that was his and that had been his, and that he had made complicated by high leaving, and might make less complicated by staying, which was a different kind of work. But work he understood how to start. He thought about Callie Voss. He thought about the corridor, 31 meters of it, and the alien standing on its side of the room while she finished what she'd come to do. He thought about the synchronized light event and running through it anyway. He thought about the transmission going out into deep space and the relief fleet changing course. and 600 people not dropping into a debris field at FTL velocity. He thought about what it meant to do something enormous, and come home to something small, and find that the small thing was the point of the enormous thing. That the enormous thing was not despite the small thing, but because of it. That somewhere in the calculation of species survival and first contact and the long, terrifying work of figuring out what we were in a universe full of things we weren't. The whole math reduced to something the size of a boy in dinosaur pajamas, who had theories about alien cognition and named things accurately. He walked down the hallway toward the warm light. 3 years later, Dr. Nadia Ose published the paper. Not the xenobiology paper that had been first. The one that came 3 years later was different. It drew on the full corpus of Renali light pattern records compiled from Kepler Station, cross-referenced with the behavioral data logged during the 4-day occupation, and it proposed something that caused the kind of quiet uproar in academic circles that looks like polite disagreement from the outside and feels, to the people in it, like the ground shifting. She proposed that the Renali had understood more than anyone had assumed during the occupation. Not human language, there was no evidence of that, but pattern, intent, structure. The mathematical sequence Kali had held up at the corridor junction on day 1 had registered. The environmental modification timing, Mickelson's cascade disturbance, had registered. The decision to run during the synchronized event rather than wait it out. Each of these, Nadia argued, had been a kind of sentence. Not in any Renali vocabulary, but legible the way music is legible across languages. Not the words, but the shape of it. The rhythm of a species trying to solve a problem with what it had. The texture of stubborn, improvisational, slightly chaotic human ingenuity. There was one thing she gave particular attention to, in the paper. In the final section, which was the most speculative, and the one that drew the most argument, she returned to the moment in Module 3. The Renali that had followed Kali through the access hatch, the 4-meter distance it maintained, its positioning on the far side of the room while the transmission ran, and the gesture, the primary limb placed flat against the wall, held for 3 seconds then retracted. It had taken her 3 years to find it in the light pattern corpus, but she'd found it. It was a permission signal. A term she was using loosely and knew she was using loosely. But there was a Renali light configuration that appeared consistently in their archived behavioral patterns at moments corresponding to what might be called the granting of space, the granting of room, a signal that communicated something in the vicinity of, continue, I see what you are doing, I will not interfere. In the Renali pattern corpus she'd catalogued, it appeared in 3 contexts. Between individuals of apparently different status during environmental engineering operations, between paired individuals in the synchronized event's aftermath, and once, in the entire 4 years of observational record she had access to. In the behavioral log of a Renali unit occupying Module 3 of Kepler Station, 4th day of the incursion, at 0344. The same gesture, placed on a wall, for a human woman who was completing a transmission she'd risked her life to send. Nadia sat with that for a long time before she wrote it into the paper. She sat with the question of what it meant. Not scientifically, she knew what it meant scientifically, but in the larger sense. The sense that made your throat tight in a way that wasn't grief and wasn't joy, but was something between them that also didn't have a name yet. She decided it meant this, that on a deep space station, in a corridor smelling of alien atmosphere and machine oil, a species that thought in light had watched a species that thought in language do something reckless and precise and specifically, irreducibly human, and had made a decision not to withdraw and not to interfere, to give room. Maybe that was what first contact always was, underneath all the politics and xenobiology and military protocol. Not a grand moment of universal understanding, just 2 entirely different things, in the same small space, choosing not to be afraid of each other, choosing to give room. Callie Voss read the paper on a Thursday afternoon in her apartment on EO, sitting at a kitchen table with bad coffee, mechanical knee aching from the pressure change. And when she got to the final section, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. She thought about a corridor. 31 meters. The smell of something other. She thought about the way she'd laughed, that brief, Involuntary exhale of accumulated fear, and the way the membrane had shifted. She thought about the gesture. The limb on the wall. She called Nadia. You knew, she said when Nadia picked up. I suspected, Nadia said. I couldn't be sure until I found the corpus match. It was giving me permission. I think so, yes. Callie sat with that. With all the enormous weight of it. All the enormously ordinary feeling of sitting at a kitchen table with bad coffee learning. Something she would spend the rest of her life turning. Nadia, she said. Yeah, we have to get better at this. I know. All of it, the language, the patterns. All of it, I know, Nadia said. That's what the paper is for. Outside the apartment window, the pale light of Io's sky. The gas giant Jupiter hanging at the horizon like a warm, enormous eye, striped in russet and cream. Beyond it, invisible and vast, the universe going about its ancient business, full of things that thought in shapes human language didn't have words for yet. Callie drank her bad coffee. She thought about a boy named Eli who had theories. She thought about a father in a too small chair, telling the truth sideways, the way you sometimes have to. She thought about what it meant to give room. Then she opened her tablet and started drafting the response paper, because there was work to do. And the universe was large. And the first conversation between two species who saw the world in entirely different light had barely begun.